The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Millbrook, Connecticut, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The kind of place where secrets were currency and gossip traveled faster than the speed of light. At the heart of this small New England community stood Henderson's General Store, a weathered brick building that had anchored the corner of Main and Elm for over a century. Margaret Henderson wiped down the same glass counter she'd been cleaning for the past 43 years, her movements mechanical and precise. At 68, her silver hair was pulled back in the same bun she'd worn since her wedding day, and her blue eyes held the weight of too many sleepless nights. The store around her breathed with history, shelves lined with everything from penny candy to fishing hooks, wooden floors that creaked with the footsteps of 4 generations of customers. "Mom, you've cleaned that counter 3 times already," said David Henderson, emerging from the back office with a clipboard in hand. At 45, he carried himself with the resigned efficiency of a man who'd inherited responsibility too early. His dark hair showed premature grey at the temples, and worry lines had carved permanent paths around his eyes. Margaret didn't look up. "Keeps my hands busy." David set the clipboard aside and approached his mother, recognizing the familiar ritual. Every October brought the same restless energy, the same compulsive cleaning, the same haunted look in her eyes. October 15th was approaching, the anniversary of the day that had torn their family apart and left a hole that 12 years couldn't fill. "She would have been 20 now," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the old refrigerator unit. David's jaw tightened. They'd had this conversation countless times, but it never got easier. "Mom, we've been through this. The police, the FBI, the private investigators, they all said the same thing. After this long—" "Don't!" Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." The bell above the front door chimed, and both mother and son turned toward the sound with the practiced smile of shopkeepers. A young woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, the morning light creating a halo around her figure. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long auburn hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She wore a simple white sundress and carried a small, worn backpack. "Good morning," David said, his voice carrying the warm professionalism he'd perfected over years of customer service. "Can we help you find something?" The young woman stepped further into the store, her eyes scanning the familiar layout with an expression David couldn't quite read. There was something in her gaze, recognition mixed with confusion, like someone trying to remember a dream upon waking. She began, then stopped, her hand unconsciously reaching up to touch a small scar above her left eyebrow. "I think I've been here before." Margaret's cleaning cloth slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. The woman's voice carried a slight tremor, but underneath it was something that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. An inflection, a cadence that she'd heard echoing in her dreams for 12 long years. "Are you from around here?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the earthquake happening in her chest. The young woman shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't remember." She paused, confusion flickering across her features. "That sounds crazy, doesn't it?" David stepped forward, his businessman's instincts kicking in, despite the strange atmosphere that had suddenly filled the store. "Memory problems aren't uncommon. Have you seen a doctor?" "Doctors?" The woman's laugh held no humor. "Yes, I've seen plenty of doctors. They have lots of theories, but no real answers." She moved deeper into the store, her fingers trailing along the edge of the counter where Margaret had been cleaning. "They tell me I have what they call dissociative amnesia. Basically, my brain decided to lock away everything that happened before I was found." Margaret's legs suddenly felt unsteady. "Found? 8 years ago. I was discovered wandering along a highway in Nevada. No identification, no memory of how I got there. The authorities estimated I was about 12 or 13, though I looked younger. Malnourished, they said. The woman's voice had taken on a detached quality, as if she were reciting someone else's story. They called me Jane Doe until the foster family that took me in gave me a name. Sarah Mitchell. The name hung in the air like smoke. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. David moved closer to his mother, recognizing the signs of an approaching breakdown. Sarah, Margaret repeated, testing the name on her tongue. That's a beautiful name. It never felt like mine, Sarah admitted, then looked embarrassed by the confession. Sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you all this. It's just, this place feels familiar somehow, like a memory that's just out of reach. David cleared his throat, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even as his world tilted on its axis. Well, this store has been here for over 100 years. Lots of people have passed through these doors. Maybe you visited as a child with your family? Maybe. Sarah's eyes continued to roam the store, taking in details with an intensity that made David uncomfortable. She paused at the candy display, her head tilting slightly, as if listening to a sound only she could hear. Do you sell those little chocolate soldiers? The ones wrapped in gold foil? Margaret's breath caught in her throat. We used to. They were a special order item. Not many people asked for them. I can almost taste them, Sarah murmured, her hand reaching toward the candy display before she caught herself and pulled back. This is going to sound strange, but I keep having this dream. I'm 8 years old, standing right here, and someone, a woman with kind eyes, is giving me one of those chocolate soldiers. She tells me it's our little secret. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt as if the floor had opened beneath her feet. Those chocolate soldiers had been Emma's favorite treat, the special candy Margaret would slip to her youngest daughter when her older siblings weren't looking. It had been their tradition, their private joke, their special bond. Mom? David's voice seemed to come from very far away. Mom, are you okay? Margaret couldn't speak. She stared at Sarah with a mixture of hope and terror, her mind racing through possibilities that seemed too incredible to believe. The young woman standing before her was the right age, the right height. Her hair was darker than Emma's had been, but hair color could change. Her eyes, though, those green eyes were unmistakably familiar. I should go, Sarah said suddenly, apparently sensing the tension in the room. I'm sorry for bothering you. I don't know what came over me. Wait. The word escaped Margaret's lips before she could stop it. Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. What's your last memory? From before you were found? Sarah's shoulders tensed. Flashes, fragments, running through trees in the dark, being very scared. And she turned back toward Margaret, her eyes distant. A woman crying. Someone saying my name over and over, but not Sarah, another name. What name? Margaret whispered. Emma. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Someone was calling for Emma. The glass Margaret had been holding slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. The sharp sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room captive. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm, and she quickly pushed through the door, the bell chiming frantically as she disappeared into the busy street. David knelt beside his mother, carefully picking up the larger pieces of broken glass, while Margaret stood frozen, staring at the empty doorway. Mum, talk to me. What just happened? Margaret's voice, when it finally came, was hollow with shock. She knew about the chocolate soldiers, David. She knew about our secret. Mom, lots of kids like chocolate. It could be a coincidence. She said someone was calling for Emma. Margaret turned to her son, her eyes bright with tears. What if it's her? What if she's come home? David wanted to tell his mother to be reasonable, to remember the disappointment of all the false leads they'd followed over the years. But as he looked into Margaret's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in 12 long years: hope. And despite his better judgment, he felt it stirring in his own chest. Outside, Sarah Mitchell walked quickly down Main Street, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't understand. The logical part of her mind told her to keep walking, to catch the next bus out of this small town, and never look back. But something deeper, something that felt like instinct or memory, was pulling her in the opposite direction. She found herself standing across the street from Henderson's general store, studying the weathered sign and the familiar windows. In her pocket, her fingers worried the edges of a small piece of paper, the address she'd found among her few possessions when she'd aged out of the foster system. An address that had led her here, to this moment, to these people who looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Sarah didn't remember writing down this address. She didn't remember much of anything from the first 12 years of her life. But somewhere in the locked chambers of her mind, she knew this place mattered. She knew the woman with the silver hair and kind eyes mattered, and she knew that whatever had brought her here was bigger than coincidence. As she watched through the store window, she saw David helping his mother to a chair behind the counter. The older woman was shaking, her face pale with shock. Sarah felt a stab of guilt for upsetting her, followed immediately by something else. A fierce, protective instinct that she didn't understand. A memory fragment surfaced unbidden, strong arms lifting her, a voice whispering, "Everything's going to be okay, baby girl." The scent of lavender and vanilla. The memory was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving Sarah breathless and confused. She knew she should leave. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to walk away from whatever complicated situation she'd stumbled into. But as she stood there on the sidewalk, watching the two people in the store who seemed to know her better than she knew herself, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was going to stay. She was going to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be, because for the first time in 8 years, she had a clue about who she really was, and she wasn't going to let that slip away. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when Sarah finally crossed the street again, her hand steady as she pushed open the door to Henderson's general store. The bell chimed softly, and Margaret looked up from behind the counter, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. "I thought you might come back," Margaret said quietly. "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted. "But I need to know if there's even a chance that I'm—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Emma," Margaret whispered. Her name was Emma Rose Henderson. She disappeared on October 15th, 2012. She was 8 years old. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. October 15th, the date that haunted her dreams, the day that her nightmares always centered around. "Tell me about her," she said, her voice barely steady. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a worn photo album. "Would you like to see?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. As Margaret opened the album and turned it toward her, Sarah found herself looking at pictures of a little girl with bright green eyes and auburn curls, a girl who could have been her younger self. But it was the last photo that made Sarah's knees buckle. It showed the little girl standing in this very store, a chocolate soldier in her small hand and a mischievous grin on her face. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Margaret, 12 years younger but with the same kind eyes, the same gentle smile. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "It's true. It's really true." And as the recognition crashed over her like a wave, Sarah Mitchell remembered her real name, remembered the family she'd lost, and remembered that she was finally, impossibly, home. The Millbrook Police Department hadn't seen this much activity since the Henderson case first broke 12 years ago. Detective Ray Morrison sat across from Sarah Mitchell, or Emma Henderson, as she was now tentatively being called, in the same interrogation room where he'd questioned dozens of suspects and witnesses during the original investigation. At 55, Morrison had weathered face that spoke of too many sleepless nights and cases that never quite closed properly in his mind. "I know this is difficult," Morrison said, his voice gentle but professional. "But I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Even the smallest detail could be important." Sarah, Emma, gripped the paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows, making her look younger and more vulnerable than her 20 years. "I've tried so hard to remember. The doctors said forcing it might make things worse, but now you're ready," Morrison finished. "Take your time." Emma closed her eyes, trying to reach into the dark corners of her memory. "It was my birthday party, October 15th. I remember being excited because Mom had made my favorite cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting. There were balloons everywhere, and David had given me a new book about horses." Morrison made notes, though he remembered these details from the original case file. Emma's 8th birthday party had been a family affair, held in the backyard of the Henderson home on Maple Street. Approximately 30 people had been in attendance, including family members, neighbors, and Emma's classmates from school. "What's the last clear memory you have from that night?" Morrison asked. Emma's brow furrowed with concentration. "Playing hide-and-seek with my cousins. I found this perfect hiding spot behind the garden shed. I remember being so proud that no one could find me." Her voice grew quieter. "I must have fallen asleep back there, because the next thing I remember, it was dark and everyone was calling my name. But you didn't answer them. I couldn't." Emma's eyes snapped open, sudden fear flickering across her features. "Someone was there, behind me. I remember a hand covering my mouth and a voice telling me to be quiet. Then, nothing. The next clear memory I have is waking up in that hospital in Nevada 8 years later." Morrison leaned forward slightly. This was new information. None of the previous interviews with Emma had yielded these details. "Can you describe the voice, male or female? Any accent or distinguishing characteristics?" "Male," Emma said without hesitation. "Definitely male. He smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sweet, like cherry cough drops." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to the small scar above her eyebrow. "He kept saying he was sorry, over and over, that he didn't want to hurt me." The door to the interrogation room opened, and Detective Lisa Chang entered with a thick file folder. Chang was Morrison's younger partner, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had transferred to Millbrook specifically to work cold cases. She'd spent the last 6 months reviewing the Henderson file, convinced that something had been missed during the original investigation. "Sorry to interrupt," Chang said, setting the folder on the table, "but we just got some interesting information from Nevada. Emma, do you remember the name of the family that fostered you?" "The Mitchells. Robert and Carol Mitchell. They were—" Emma's voice caught slightly. "They were good people. They tried so hard to help me remember, to find my family. When nothing turned up in the system, they legally adopted me." Chang opened the folder and pulled out a document. "We contacted them this morning. They're flying out tonight to be with you, by the way. But they also provided us with something interesting." She slid a photograph across the table. "This was found in your backpack when you were discovered on that highway. Do you recognize it?" Emma picked up the photograph, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of Henderson's general store, slightly faded and creased as if it had been handled many times. On the back, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Home Sweet Home," and an address. "I drew this," Emma whispered. I remember drawing this, but not when or where or... She looked up at Morrison with confusion and fear in her eyes. How did I have this picture with me? Morrison exchanged glances with Chang. That's what we're trying to figure out. Emma, during those 8 years between your disappearance and when you were found, do you have any memories at all? Dreams, nightmares, anything? Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. Sometimes I dream about a house, a small house with yellow curtains in the kitchen. There's a man there, but he's different from the one who took me. Older, kinder. He teaches me things. How to read better, how to make pancakes, how to tend a garden. She looked up at the detectives. In the dreams, he calls me his little bird. Chang made a note. Anything else about this house? Location? Other people? Specific details? There's a woman sometimes. She comes and goes. She's sick. I remember that clearly. She coughs a lot and takes pills. She's the one who gives me art supplies, who teaches me to draw. Emma's voice grew stronger as the memories surfaced. She's the one who helps me draw this picture of the store. She says it's important that I remember where I came from. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. Emma, this is very important. In these memories, do you ever hear names? Do they call each other anything specific? Emma closed her eyes again, concentrating. Henry, the man's name is Henry, and the woman calls me by my real name. She says Emma over and over, like she's trying to help me remember. She says that someday I'll go home, but first I have to be safe. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Morrison and Chang both knew the significance of what Emma had just revealed. If her memories were accurate, it meant that she hadn't been held by her original kidnapper for all those years. Someone else had been caring for her, someone who knew her real identity and wanted her to remember her family. Emma, Chang said gently, we're going to show you some photographs. I want you to tell me if you recognize any of these people. Chang opened another section of the file and spread out several photographs on the table. They were surveillance photos and mugshots of individuals who had been questioned during the original investigation. Neighbors, family friends, anyone who had been at the birthday party or had access to the Henderson family. Emma studied the photos carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. She paused at several, shaking her head until she reached one near the bottom of the pile. A gasp escaped her lips, and her hand flew to her mouth. That's him, she breathed. That's Henry. Morrison looked at the photograph Emma was pointing to and felt his blood run cold. The image showed a man in his 60s with kind eyes and graying hair. Henry Cartwright, Margaret Henderson's older brother. Henry had been questioned extensively during the original investigation, but his alibi had been solid. He'd been at the hospital with his dying wife during the time of Emma's disappearance. Are you certain? Morrison asked, though he could see the recognition in Emma's eyes. Absolutely. He's older in this picture than in my memories, but it's definitely him. He's the one who took care of me. Emma looked confused. But I don't understand. If he's family, why didn't he bring me home? Why did he let everyone think I was dead? Before Morrison could answer, the door burst open, and Margaret Henderson rushed in, followed closely by David and a man Morrison recognized as James Henderson, David's older brother. Margaret's face was streaked with tears, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the few hours since Emma had first walked into the store. Is it true? Margaret demanded, her voice breaking. Is it really her? Morrison stood, gently but firmly guiding the family back toward the door. Mrs. Henderson, I understand you're anxious for answers, but we're in the middle of an important interview. I promise we'll update you as soon as... No! Emma's voice cut through the chaos. She stood from her chair, her eyes locked on Margaret's face. Let them stay, please. I need to ask them about Henry. Margaret's face went white at the mention of her brother's name. Henry? What does Henry have to do with this? Mom, David said, his voice warning, maybe we should wait for the lawyers. No lawyers, Emma said firmly. Not yet. I just need to understand. She turned to Margaret, her green eyes intense. Henry Cartwright is your brother. He took care of me for years after I was kidnapped. But why? Why didn't he bring me home? Margaret sank into a chair that Chang quickly provided, her hands shaking. Henry died 4 years ago, she whispered. Lung cancer. He never said anything about you, about knowing where you were. Tell me about him, Emma pressed. Tell me about the man who saved my life. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at this young woman who might be her daughter. Henry was uncomplicated. He was my older brother and he loved our family fiercely. When you disappeared, it nearly destroyed him. He blamed himself because he'd been at the hospital with Ruth, his wife, instead of at your party. James Henderson, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. At 48, he was the eldest of the Henderson children and had always been protective of his family's reputation. Henry had problems, he said bluntly. Mental health issues, depression, anxiety. After Ruth died, he became a recluse. We barely saw him. But he was a good man, Margaret insisted, shooting her eldest son a sharp look. He would never hurt anyone, especially not Emma. Emma felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place. He was protecting me, she said slowly. In my memories, he was always worried about someone finding us. He'd make me hide whenever cars came down the road. And he kept saying that someday it would be safe for me to go home. Morrison felt his detective instincts kicking into high gear. Emma, did Henry ever mention who he was protecting you from? Did he ever talk about the person who originally took you? Emma's face scrunched in concentration. He called him the bad man. He said the bad man had made a mistake, that he'd taken me when he meant to take someone else. Henry said he'd found me wandering in the woods, scared and hurt, and that the bad man was still looking for me. Chang leaned forward. Do you remember how you got hurt? The scar on your forehead. Emma's hand moved unconsciously to the small mark above her eyebrow. I fell. I was running through the woods, trying to get away, and I tripped over a fallen tree. When I woke up, Henry was there. He cleaned my cut and gave me his jacket because I was cold. The room was silent as everyone processed this information. Morrison's mind was racing, reassessing everything they thought they knew about the Henderson case. If Emma's memories were accurate, it meant that Henry Cartwright had essentially rescued her from her kidnapper, then hidden her away for her own protection. But why didn't he contact us? David asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why did he let us think she was dead for all those years? Emma closed her eyes, reaching deeper into her recovered memories. He tried, she said suddenly. I remember him making phone calls late at night, whispering into the phone. And he got angry sometimes, frustrated. He'd say things like, they won't listen and they think I'm crazy. Margaret gasped. The calls! Oh my God, the calls! Everyone turned to look at her. Margaret's face had gone pale, and she was staring at Emma with a mixture of horror and recognition. What calls, Mom? David demanded. For years after Emma disappeared, we'd get these strange phone calls, heavy breathing, sometimes a man's voice saying things like, she's safe or don't give up hope. The police traced them, but they always came from payphones or burner phones. We thought it was some sick person playing pranks. Morrison felt the pieces of the case shifting in his mind like tectonic plates. Mrs. Henderson, did you ever suspect these calls might be from your brother? Margaret shook her head slowly. Henry never... he was grieving Ruth and he was acting strange, but we never thought... The police said the calls were probably from a crank. Because Henry had a history of mental illness, Chang said, understanding dawning in her voice. When he tried to tell people he'd found Emma, they assumed he was having a breakdown. Emma felt a surge of protective anger for the man who had saved her life. He wasn't crazy. He was brave. He risked everything to keep me safe from whoever really took me. Morrison stood, his mind already working through the implications of this new information. Emma, I need you to try to remember everything you can about this bad man Henry mentioned. Any details, no matter how small, could help us figure out who really kidnapped you and why. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be painful memories. I'll try, but there's something else you need to know. She looked around the room at the faces of her family, people who had loved her and mourned her for 12 years. The woman I mentioned, the one who came to visit Henry's house sometimes. I think she knew who I was too. What makes you say that? Chang asked. Because the last time I saw her, she was very sick. She could barely stand up, but she took my hands and she said, Emma Rose Henderson, it's time for you to go home. She gave me money for a bus ticket and this address. Emma pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. She said to follow the road until I found the store in the picture. Margaret began to cry, the sound raw and broken. David moved to comfort his mother, while James stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger. Who was she? Morrison asked. Did Henry ever say her name? Emma shook her head. He just called her my friend. But she knew things about our family. She knew about the chocolate soldiers, about Mom's lavender perfume, about the way David used to read me bedtime stories. Emma's voice grew stronger. She helped me remember who I really was, piece by piece, and when she was dying, she made sure I found my way home. Morrison closed his notebook, knowing they had enough information to reopen the case with an entirely new direction. Emma, we're going to need you to work with a sketch artist to recreate images of both the original kidnapper and this woman who helped you. And we'll need to search Henry's property, his house, any outbuildings, anywhere he might have kept records or evidence. Henry's house burned down 2 years ago, James said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. Electrical fire. The whole place was a total loss. Chang and Morrison exchanged glances. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient. Mr. Henderson, Chang said carefully, was there an investigation into that fire? James shrugged. It was ruled accidental. Old wiring, they said. Henry had been dead for 2 years by then, and the place was abandoned. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. That's not right, she said quietly. The house didn't burn down 2 years ago. It burned down 8 years ago, right before I was found on that highway in Nevada. The room fell into stunned silence. James's face had gone red, and he was looking everywhere except at Emma's face. James, Margaret said slowly, what aren't you telling us? Before James could answer, Emma stood up from her chair, memories flooding back with startling clarity. You, she breathed, staring at James. You were there, the night of the fire. You were arguing with Henry about me. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon as he read the guilt written across James Henderson's face. Whatever secrets this family had been keeping for 12 years, they were about to come to light. And Emma realized that coming home was going to be far more complicated and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The silence in the interrogation room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. James Henderson stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions, guilt, fear, and something that looked dangerously close to rage. Detective Morrison's hand remained near his weapon, his 25 years of experience telling him that cornered men made dangerous decisions. James, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Tell me Emma is wrong. Tell me you weren't there. Emma's recovered memories were flowing like a dam had burst. She could see it all now. The night Henry's house burned, the shouting voices, the smell of gasoline and smoke. "You came to Henry's house," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You were angry. You said keeping me was destroying the family, that everyone needed to move on." "Emma, stop," David warned, sensing the dangerous undercurrent in the room. But Emma couldn't stop. 12 years of stolen memories demanded their due. "Henry told you I wasn't ready to come home yet. He said the man who took me was still out there, still dangerous, but you didn't care. You said the family's reputation was more important than—" "Enough!" James's voice exploded through the room like a gunshot. His composure had finally cracked, revealing the raw desperation beneath. "You don't understand. None of you understand what I had to do to protect this family." Morrison stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Mr. Henderson, I need you to sit down and tell us exactly what happened. Right now." James looked around the room at the faces of his family, his mother's horror, David's confusion, Emma's unwavering stare. His shoulders sagged as 20 years of secrets finally overwhelmed him. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, collapsing into a chair. "The plan was simple, clean, no one was supposed to get hurt." Margaret felt the world tilting beneath her. "What plan? James, what are you talking about?" Emma's blood ran cold as another memory surfaced. "The birthday party," she said slowly. "You weren't supposed to be there. You told everyone you had to work late, but you showed up at the last minute." James laughed bitterly. "Work? Yeah, I was working all right. Working with Vincent Torino to stage a fake kidnapping that would give us the insurance money to save the store." He looked up at his mother, tears streaming down his face. "We were 3 months away from bankruptcy, Mum. 3 months from losing everything Grandpa built, everything Dad died trying to preserve. The name Vincent Torino hit Detective Morrison like a physical blow. Torino was a known criminal, small-time but dangerous, with a history of extortion and kidnapping schemes. He'd been questioned briefly during the original investigation, but had an alibi that seemed solid at the time. "So you hired him to fake Emma's kidnapping?" Chang said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Your 8-year-old sister. It was supposed to be David's daughter, Sophie," James said, his voice hollow. "She was 6, the same size as Emma. The plan was for Vincent to grab her during the chaos of the party, hide her for a few days while we collected the ransom and insurance money, then find her safe and sound. No one gets hurt, everyone's a hero, and we save the store." David's face had gone white with rage. "You were going to kidnap my daughter?" "Sophie wasn't even supposed to be there that night," James shot back. "She was supposed to be at her mother's house with the flu, but Lisa brought her anyway because she was feeling better." Emma felt sick as the pieces fell into place. "So Vincent took me instead. It was dark. You and Sophie looked similar from behind. By the time Vincent realized his mistake, you were already—" James's voice broke. "You were already gone." Margaret had been silent through this revelation, but now she spoke, her voice like ice. "You let us think our baby was dead for 12 years because of your greed." "It wasn't greed," James exploded. "It was survival. Do you know what it was like being the eldest son, having everyone expect me to save the family business? Dad died of a heart attack, worrying about the debt. I wasn't going to let that happen to you, too." Morrison leaned forward, but something went wrong with Vincent's part of the plan. James nodded miserably. "Vincent was supposed to keep Emma safe until we could figure out what to do, but he panicked. Started talking about getting rid of the evidence, about how no one would ever know what really happened to her." James looked at Emma, his eyes pleading. "I never wanted you hurt. When I realized what Vincent was planning, I tried to call it off, but he said it was too late." Emma's memories were crystallizing with painful clarity. "But Henry found me first." Henry was supposed to be at the hospital with Ruth that night, but she'd had a good day and he decided to come to your party at the last minute. He saw Vincent carrying you into the woods and followed. James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Henry saved your life, Emma. He took you from Vincent and hid you away before Vincent could... The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a threat. Everyone in the room understood what Vincent Torino had been planning to do to eliminate the evidence of his crime. Chang spoke up. "What happened to Vincent?" "Henry killed him," James said flatly. "Self-defense," he said. "Vincent tried to take Emma back, and Henry hit him with a piece of firewood. Vincent went down and never got back up." Morrison felt his worldview shifting again. So Henry wasn't just protecting Emma from Vincent, he was protecting her from you. "Henry knew I was involved," James admitted. "He confronted me that night, said he'd seen me talking to Vincent before the party. He said he was going to take Emma somewhere safe until he could figure out what to do." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "The woman, the one who visited Henry's house, who was she?" James's face crumpled. "Helen Torino, Vincent's sister. She was a nurse, and she was dying of cancer. When Vincent disappeared, she went looking for him. Somehow, she tracked Henry down, figured out what had happened, and instead of turning Henry in, she helped him," Emma said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Helen felt responsible for her brother's actions. She knew what kind of man Vincent was, knew what he would have done to you, so she helped Henry take care of you, helped you remember who you were." James looked at Emma with something approaching reverence. "When Helen knew she was dying, she made sure you found your way home." Margaret had been silent through most of this confession, but now she stood up slowly, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. 20 years, she said, her voice deadly quiet. "For 20 years, I've blamed myself for not watching you closely enough. I've woken up every night wondering if you were cold, if you were scared, if you were even alive." "Mom!" James started. "Don't." Margaret's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Don't you dare call me that. A son doesn't do what you did. A son doesn't trade his sister's life for money." Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Everyone turned to look at her, expecting tears or anger, but her face was calm, almost serene. "I forgive him," she said quietly. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. James looked up at her in shock, tears streaming down his face. "Emma, you don't have to—" David started. "Yes, I do," Emma interrupted. "I've spent 8 years trying to figure out who I was, where I came from, why I was abandoned on that highway. Now I know. And I know that James made a terrible mistake. But he's also the reason I'm alive." She turned to James, her green eyes steady. "If you hadn't been there that night, if you hadn't seen what Vincent was planning to do, Henry never would have known to look for me. You saved my life even while you were destroying it." James fell to his knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry. God, Emma, I'm so sorry. I've lived with this guilt every day for 12 years. When the house burned down and we thought all evidence was gone, I thought maybe I could finally move on. But I never could. You were always there, in my dreams, asking me why." Emma knelt down beside her brother, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Because this family was worth saving," she said softly. "The store, our heritage, our name. You were right that it mattered. You just chose the wrong way to save it." Morrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Henderson, I'm going to need you to make a formal statement about your involvement in this case. There will be charges, conspiracy, accessory to kidnapping, possibly obstruction of justice." James nodded, wiping his eyes. "I understand. I'm ready to face whatever consequences come." "There's something else," Chang added. You mentioned that Vincent Torino's body was never found. We'll need to know where Henry buried him. The old mine shaft on Henry's property, James said without hesitation, about half a mile into the woods behind his house. Henry showed me the place years later, said it was the only way to keep Emma safe. If Vincent's body was ever found, people would ask questions that might lead them to her. Emma felt a chill run through her. Even in death, Vincent Torino had been a threat to her safety. Henry had been protecting her from a ghost for 12 years. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice subdued. Morrison closed his notebook. "Now we finish what we started 12 years ago. We'll recover Vincent Torino's remains, close the original kidnapping case, and begin the process of dealing with Mr. Henderson's involvement." He looked at Emma with something approaching admiration. And Emma gets to decide what she wants her life to look like moving forward. Emma stood up, looking around the room at her family, her real family, complicated and damaged as they were. "I want to come home," she said simply. "I want to help run the store, learn about our family's history, make up for lost time." She paused, looking directly at James. "All of us need to heal from this. Together." Margaret moved toward Emma tentatively, as if she were afraid the young woman might disappear again. "Are you sure? After everything that's happened, everything we've put you through?" Emma smiled, and for the first time since entering the store that morning, she looked like the little girl Margaret remembered. "I've been searching for home for 8 years. Now I've found it. A little chaos and drama just makes it more interesting." Margaret finally allowed herself to believe that this was real, that her daughter was truly home. She wrapped Emma in her arms, holding her tight enough to make up for 12 years of missed hugs. David joined the embrace, followed by a hesitant James, who looked surprised when Emma pulled him closer instead of pushing him away. "We're going to be okay," Emma whispered, and for the first time in 12 years, Margaret believed it might be true. Outside the police station, the sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The Henderson family walked slowly toward their cars, closer than they'd been in years, despite everything that had been revealed. "Emma," Margaret said, as they reached the parking lot, "would you like to see your room? I've kept it exactly the same, just in case." Emma smiled. "I'd love that, but first, can we stop by the store? I want to buy some chocolate soldiers." Margaret laughed, a sound that was part joy and part relief. "I think we can arrange that." As they drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook, Emma pressed her face to the window, taking in the sights of her hometown with new eyes. She was home, truly home, with a family that loved her enough to fight for her, even when they were fighting against each other. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be trials, therapy, difficult conversations, and the long process of rebuilding trust. But for the first time since she'd walked into Henderson's general store that morning, Emma felt complete. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the girl with no past. She was Emma Rose Henderson, daughter, sister, and survivor. She was home. Back at the store, Margaret unlocked the front door and flipped on the lights. The familiar smell of old wood and penny candy enveloped them like a hug. Emma walked to the candy display and picked up a chocolate soldier, unwrapping it carefully. "Our little secret?" she asked, echoing the words from her childhood. Margaret smiled through her tears. "Our little secret." As Emma bit into the chocolate, memories flooded back. Not the painful ones this time, but the good ones. Birthday parties and bedtime stories, family dinners and lazy Sunday afternoons. The memories that had been waiting 12 years to welcome her home. Henderson's general store had weathered many storms in its century of existence. Family disputes, economic hardships, even a kidnapping that had torn the family apart. But it had survived them all, and now it would survive this too. Because some things, family love, the bonds that tie us to our past and our future, are stronger than the worst mistakes we can make, and sometimes, just sometimes, lost things find their way home.